Hey, U.S. history. Good to see you guys. Good to see you guys again today. I hope that you liked the last week talking about progressivism. We are now. Oh, I'm on the wrong side. We are now moving ahead to chapter 19, the Great War. And I know some of you in here are military history enthusiasts, are probably thinking, "Oh, good, we're finally getting to World War II." Well, no, we're not there yet. This is the first Great War. This is World War I. We're going to be talking about. And just as to be upfront with you guys on that, this is a United States history course, so we're not going to be going too deep into the war itself. We'll talk about the basics of it, and the causes and stuff, but really our concern is America. How did America treat this war? How did it affect us as a nation? And how do we get involved? That's the key we're going to be discussing in this chapter. So for this week, here's what we're going to start with. We're going to learn a little bit more about Woodrow Wilson and his foreign policy, talk about U.S.-Mexican relations during the Wilson administration, outline the series of events that triggered the Great War in Europe, and discuss the difficulties of American neutrality during Wilson's first term. So, make sure you guys read chapter 19 by Tuesday, the 14th. And I should mention on that note, you're probably thinking, why Tuesday the 14th? We have Easter break coming up, so this Friday and the Monday of next week are off days for you guys. You guys are totally free those days. Take that time to rest, really. I mean, Easter is a huge deal in our faith. It's I know we can get caught up in the candy and the games and stuff, but really, let's not forget it is critical that Jesus Christ died and rose from the dead. That's the foundation of our Christian faith. So take some time to really take that in. And if you do Good Friday as a church, you'll probably be watching online, but I encourage you to do that. And if you're interested in watching a Good Friday service, you can talk to me. Our church celebrates Good Friday, and you guys are more than welcome to watch our service if you would like. So all that to say, though, take those days off, but I'm giving you a little bit of extra time to read, but try to read or get that read by Tuesday for sure. And check Google Classroom for everything else that you're going to need too. Okay, so skipping ahead. The nature of Wilson's foreign policy. So we talked in the last chapter about Roosevelt and Taft, right? Progressive presidents who had a lot of similarities but some differences. And one thing they both wanted to do was they wanted to get involved in other nations and influencing and controlling them in different ways. Whereas Teddy Roosevelt was all about having a real powerful military. Remember, speak softly but carry a big stick. He wanted to be able to look at our military might and show people, hey, you may want to listen to what we have to say. Whereas Taft was about dollar diplomacy, as his opponents called it, but meaning, hey, let's invest strategically. That way, nations that we help financially will respect us, and maybe they know there's future incentives to listen to us. But either way, they both wanted to use force or money, something to keep other nations in line. Wilson, on the other hand, said the United States will never again seek one additional foot of territory by conquest. What did Wilson mean by that? Wilson was what you call an idealist. He had a PhD. He was the one president we've had with a PhD. And so he lived in the world of ideas. You know, for him, it's really, when you're in the academy, everything looks great on paper. You put all sorts of nice, elaborate theories together. But those theories don't always play out in reality like they do on paper. I think Karl Marx might know a thing or two about that. But Wilson was kind of similar in that regard. He had all sorts of great ideas that sounded great in his head, but would they work in reality? His idea was he wanted the United States to lead by example. Like, they'll see the ideas of democracy and all the things we do as a nation, and then they'll see what we're doing, and they'll want to be like us, and ultimately it can be a peaceful way of influencing the world and changing things. But how successful was he at that? One thing Wilson had to do right off the bat was he had to deal with some U.S.-Mexican relations. Porfirio Diaz was the Mexican dictator from 1876 to 1911. He was a ruthless guy. The Mexicans didn't like him, but other nations tolerated him because he was all about trade. So Mexico had all sorts of good trade relations with other nations, trade relations with other nations, I should say, and people were okay with it because as long as they could get their good financial deals. Well, eventually, you can only be ruthless for so long. A guy named Francisco Madera led a coup and overthrew Diaz. But soon after, Madera was killed by Victoriano Huerta, who soon took over Mexico. So Madera takes over, but then his military commander stages a coup, and then the military commander, Victoriano Huerta, becomes the president of Mexico. And I think that Madera should have thought that Huerta's gonna hurt you. Sorry, couldn't resist. So, would you recognize this guy, Huerta, as the new president or not? Would you consider him the rightful ruler of Mexico? Most nations did. They said, whatever, we don't care. As long as he'll restore good trading relations, we're fine with whoever rules Mexico. Wilson, on the other hand, refused to support him. He said, that was a violent, unethical thing you did, so we're not going to support you as the leader of Mexico. And something similar happened in Venezuela. Actually, has been happening in Venezuela, actually. Like, Russia and some nations support Maduro as the rightful president of Venezuela, whereas the United States and other nations support Guaido as the proper president of Venezuela. And if you watched President Trump's State of the Union address earlier, then you saw that he pointed out to Guaido, and Guaido got a standing ovation from everybody, even the women in white, for being the rightful president of Venezuela. So it's interesting when you have nations that are tumultuous and you have leaders rising up being recognized by different nations, and that's what was happening 100 years ago in Mexico. So because Wilson didn't like Huerta, he said, I'm going to support anybody who opposes him. So Pancho Villa and Venustiano Carranza, these two Mexicans who wanted to overthrow Huerta and take power for themselves, were on, I guess you could say, the friends list of Wilson. So he started supporting Villa and Carranza with guns and supplies, and eventually they did successfully get rid of Huerta, and Carranza became the new president of Mexico. And Pancho Villa, on the other hand, was kind of dejected. He wanted power for himself, so he started causing problems, and he ended up rallying a bunch of Mexicans against America and started causing problems to Americans. He murdered some U.S. coal mining engineers, he sacked a border town or two, caused all sorts of issues. And you're probably thinking, well, America just helped him. Why is he turning his back on America? Well, keep in mind that America, ever since Roosevelt, has this reputation of being a bully by Mexico and the Central American nations. They're always meddling in our stuff, and so there's always a little bit of resentment toward America, and Pancho Villa just tapped right into that resentment and gathered a force around him. Wilson got so annoyed with Villa that he sent General John Pershing, who, by the way, is an incredibly good general who fought in World War I. But John Pershing and 11,000 troops went to capture Villa, but they could never find him. He continually escaped the Americans. And his followers ended up coming up with a creative little song for him called La Cucaracha, because they called him the cockroach. And if you're like me, you're probably thinking, why the heck would you name your hero a cockroach, right? That's like me naming one of you a snake or a weasel or something, you know, it just doesn't, or a gnat. It just doesn't make sense. But apparently it worked for them, so they called him La Cucaracha. And if you've ever heard this song, La Cucaracha, La Cucaracha, that comes from this time. That was the song for Pancho Villa. And his followers came up with all sorts of, it became kind of like a folky song to play, you know, where they would gather around and sing it and have fun. And there are many verses made, and this is probably my favorite verse that I found. The cockroach can't walk anymore because it's lacking marijuana to smoke. So take that as you will. Another thing that happened with our foreign affairs during Wilson's term, his first term, was issues in the Caribbean. And this is as you can see on the map here, this is the island of Hispaniola. And to put things into perspective, Cuba's over here, and then Florida's up north of Cuba. Well, this island of Hispaniola has two nations to this day, Haiti and the DR, or the Dominican Republic. And you have problems happening. In Haiti, you had virtual anarchy from 1914 to 1915, and then in the Dominican Republic, a civil war broke out in 1916. Now, you're probably thinking, well, let them fight it out. What's the big deal? Well, the concern Wilson had was that if Europe or other nations saw chaos here, they would try to take advantage of it, and they would go into, stabilize the problems, but really take over the island or something. So Wilson sent U.S. Marines to bring order and chaos to these two nations. And that way, if you think about it, the Monroe Doctrine, which, remember, you go back to our early presidents, the fifth president, James Monroe, fifth president James Monroe put the Monroe Doctrine in place, saying European nations cannot interfere with the Americas anymore. So this is sort of a way of protecting that doctrine. Because you remember that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to be the policeman of the world. Or the policeman of at least our hemisphere, and he wanted America to keep Europe out of the other American and North and South American countries. Okay, so nationalism. Sorry, I just jumped ahead there. Third point we're talking about is, now that we've talked about Mexico, now that we've talked about the Caribbean, we can leave American issues with them on hold, and we're going to go to Europe now. Sorry. And what was happening was this great war, World War I, was breaking out in Europe. Before we go into the specifics, it's important to understand that nationalism was one of the greatest causes of the war. Nationalism refers to when a country doesn't just respect and honor itself, but when it thinks it's the best thing ever. Here's my definition. Nationalism is patriotism on steroids. Our country is awesome, your country sucks. Patriotism's okay. If you like your country and you're proud to be a part of it, that's one thing. But if you think yourself as superior and you basically view other nations as less than human almost, then you're kind of hitting that nationalistic spot. You don't want to be there. Great powers like Britain, France, and Germany were very nationalistic during this time. And keep in mind that for centuries in Europe, you didn't have the nations we have today on the map. You had city-states, and then you eventually had manors, and you had small little kingdoms and small tracts of land that were governed by barons and all, kings and nobles, and you basically had a whole mess of who controlled what. But eventually, chunks of land became, with similar cultures and languages, started to come together as nations. So even from city-states to nation-states, where nations developed and they had a certain pride. They were proud to be British, they were proud to be French, they were proud to be German, and so on and so forth. And Germany, by the way, had just become the Germany we know of. The borders have changed since, but became Germany in the 1870s. So they're a pretty new power to this whole mix. But the other thing we're talking about is the powder keg of Europe, as historians call it, which is the Balkans. And I'll come right back to this slide, but my slide for some reason wouldn't work. But this is the Balkan Peninsula over here. And this is one of the messiest places in geography. It's always changing. The borders and the countries are always changing. But the Balkan Peninsula was basically the powder keg, as people called it, in World War I. There was a lot of nationalism growing there, and particularly a movement you need to be aware of is called Pan-Slavism. Slavic peoples live in Russia and Eastern European nations, but they're this group of, basically they're a particular type of people, and they were spread out through the Balkans, and they wanted to have all Slavic people come together as one and have this Slavic sort of nationalism. And that was a really important deal in World War I because of what results from that. So what is the spark that blows everything up? Well, on June 28, 1914, a Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir of Austria-Hungary, and this sparked World War I. He was visiting Sarajevo on a pretty hardcore. It was a national, like a patriotic sort of day for them. And when the Archduke, the Archduke visits his people, the Austrian-Hungarians had control over them, the people didn't really like him being there, even though he was kind of a moderate. And so what happens is this Black Hand terrorist group, a few people from there, organized this attack to sort of assassinate him, and they did. And honestly, we could spend a lot of time on this, but I want to keep us moving. But I will say this, look up the wrong turn made by his driver. Had the Archduke's driver made the right turn, we may not have had this whole thing blow up. Interesting thought. Anyways, Austria declares war on Serbia on July 28th because they held them responsible for the for the assassination happening in their country. And then everybody starts declaring war on everybody. Austria declared war on Serbia, like we said. Russia declares war on Austria. Germany declares war on France. Great Britain declares war on Germany, and so on and so forth. And the one thing, a lot of you guys aren't going to really remember all these different details, but the point I want you guys to capture from this is this. The problem with alliances, just because you form an alliance with a nation doesn't necessarily mean it's all hunky-dory and that you're going to benefit from it. Because you can get dragged into things you don't want to deal with. If you have a stupid war that your ally is getting dragged into, now you're going to get stuck getting dragged into it. And World War I shows a great example of the dark side of alliances. So, jumping into this, Germany realized that they were kind of in a bad spot. You have France to their west, and you have Russia to their east, and eventually you'd have Great Britain, join on the opposing side too, across the channel. So Germany's thinking, what are we going to do? So they came up with what's called the Schlieffen Plan, which is just fun to say, the Schlieffen Plan. And Germany basically had this idea that they would rush into France as fast as possible, overthrow Paris and overthrow France, turn around, and then deal with the Russians who would not be suspecting to meet an organized German resistance. So that was their plan. Take over France really quickly and then fight Germany when they came to help their French allies. One problem with the German plan is it involved them going through Belgium. And Belgium was a neutral nation. They didn't want to be on any side, so they didn't want to help or hurt anybody, and nobody could pass through their land. But Germany didn't really care. And so what ends up happening is that Great Britain suspected Germany was going to do something and violate Belgium's neutrality. So Britain threatened their leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and said, hey, if you violate Belgium's neutrality by going through their borders, then we're going to declare war on you. And the Kaiser said, screw you, and he basically treated the threat as a scrap piece of paper, and they marched through Belgium anyway, and then the British jumped in against Germany and sided with the French and the Russians, and became, I guess you could say, the third great part of the Triple Entente. And so what ends up happening is the British and French forces knew that Germany was going to try to take over Paris, so they came together and they were able to stop the German war machine. France lost over 200,000 men in the first month of the war, which is crazy to think about that number. But again, this is a pretty hardcore war, to say the least. And when we get later on to the Treaty of Versailles, and when the war ends, you'll see that France was a little bit harsh on Germany, and what they wanted Germany to do after the war. And you can kind of understand why the French were so upset with Germany just by looking at this one statistic alone. Okay, moving on. So then you have the sides here. So I know there's many other nations involved, but this is to keep it simple. This is what our book does. The Central Powers were Germany and Austria. And yes, you have the Ottoman Empire and other nations that join in, but these are really the most formidable nations. Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Allies, which is also called the Triple Entente in a lot of textbooks, but our textbook says Allies, were France, Britain, and Russia. And again, this is just starting the war, and these are the major players. More would join on both sides. But that's just so you can keep it easy for now, the two sides of the conflict. Now, the last point is, what about Americans during this time? How did Americans process the war? Well, we wanted to be neutral. We did not want to send thousands of our men over to Europe to die. So we wanted to be neutral, and Wilson was very adamant on wanting to be neutral. But there were some factors that hurt our desire to be neutral. Number one was melting pot problems. We had a lot of German Americans who, obviously, they were going to side with Germany. And we also had a lot of Irish Americans. And believe it or not, the Irish Americans were pro-Central Powers because they hated the British. Absolutely despised them. So even though they weren't exactly friends with Germany, they hated Great Britain, so they didn't want to ever fight on their side. But on the other side, of course, you also had our strong British heritage. We had British settlers move here and start the whole thing, so we have had a British heritage from the beginning, so that's always sort of led us to side with Britain. The second problem was the trade trigger, that we ended up stopping trade with Central Powers. Part of the reason is because the British were blockading Germany. And so that was a problem for trying to get goods over to Germany anyway. But also, again, you kind of have that British bias going into things. So we ended up trading with allied nations. And when they ran out of money, we said, okay, we'll give you loans so you can continue buying from us, because we didn't want our economy to come to a grinding halt. So we started giving them loans so they could buy our goods. So it's kind of a great deal for America. We're loaning them money to buy our own stuff. So you can see it's very good for the American banks here. The third thing, this is the most significant according to the book, and I'm inclined to agree, that the Germans kept violating America's rights on the sea, according to some anyway. And this really, even if you don't think America's rights were violated, it ticked off America enough to get us involved. So because Britain was blockading Germany, stopping them from getting goods. By the way, if you don't know what a blockade is, I should have mentioned. A blockade is when you basically have ships patrolling the coast of a nation that you're fighting, and those ships will stop anybody from going through to give food or supplies to the nation you're attacking. So British ships were patrolling the German coast and trying to stop the Germans from receiving goods. So in response, the Germans created submarines, and now they called them, in Deutsch, it's Unterseeboot, which is just fun to say. You can abbreviate that as U-boat, which is nice and easy too. But German submarines sank many, many ships. And this ended up becoming unrestricted submarine warfare, is what a lot of historians call it. And what ends up happening is they were patrolling around and shooting any French or British ships. And that becomes a problem, you'll see. The Lusitania was a British passenger liner, and it was going to leave New York to go back. And they were told, the Germans even published something in the New York Times saying, hey, Americans, do not get on the Lusitania, because if it enters into a war zone, you will be shot. That's just war. Well, some Americans decided to board anyway, and 128 of them jumped on the thing. And as soon as the ship went into war zone waters near Ireland, the ship was sunk. And of course, Americans were outraged and called the Germans monsters. But to be fair and objective here, the Germans warned the Americans. The ship was also, it says, the book calls it a passenger liner, but the Lusitania was also a munitions ship, so of course you're going to shoot it down. And third, it was in the war zone. But at any rate, it ticked off Americans and caused some problems. Another thing that happened was the Sussex. March 24, 1916, a German submarine sank an unarmed French passenger liner, the Sussex, in the English Channel, and some Americans were aboard, and they died, of course, in the ship's crash, or in the ship's sinking, rather. So Wilson did something pretty bold. He issued what's called the Sussex Pledge. And basically he told Germany, if you guys attack any more unarmed merchant vessels or passenger vessels, then we're going to break diplomatic ties with you, and it very likely could lead us to going to war with you. Now, what's this? You might think about, that sounds like a pretty good pledge, but there's some problems with that. Wilson is trying his best to avoid neutrality, but now he just set an absolute condition in place. And if that condition gets violated, then he's kind of stuck. He basically tied his own hands now with the Sussex Pledge. So you could call that sort of a slippery slope leading us into the war, as we'll see what happens. I should mention, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about this when we talk about America entering the war, but before we move past the Lusitania, there were a lot of propaganda posters put together based on the Lusitania. Look, enlist. This is encouraging American men to join the military. This is a woman drowning with her baby, obviously referring to the Lusitania. Irishmen, avenge the Lusitania, people drowning in the ocean, the ship sinking in the background. So you could say that American recruiters got a lot of mileage out of the Lusitania. So, the election of 1916, Woodrow Wilson won a second term in office, and his slogan was, "He kept us out of war." But would that continue to be the case? Would we continue to stay neutral in this war? Well, we'll find out next week. But for this week, you already watched the lecture, so kudos to you. Participate in the discussion, and there's a worksheet I gave you guys. Make sure you go through this lecture and fill in everything that you need to do and submit that to me. And lastly, watch CNN 10. Only Monday through Thursday this week. Leave a comment by Thursday. Everything's going to be due by Thursday, you'll see, because I want you guys to have Friday off. So, take that time to relax and enjoy Good Friday. But these are the things you need to do. Check Google Classroom and email me if you have any questions. Love you guys. Have a good rest of the week.